The Millionaire's quadruplets drove away every nanny until she arrived and did the impossible. The November rain fell over Edinburgh like silver threads slicing through a curtain of thick gray fog. On the edge of the city, perched high on a hill, the Langford Mansion stood like a lonely fortress. Cold stone walls, tall windows, and faint lights flickering inside. It had once been a symbol of happiness, but now it was nothing more than a prison for 4 lost souls. Edward Langford, 38, founder of Langford Systems, was hailed as the mind behind the New Britain. He owned everything a man could dream of: wealth, influence, prestige, everything except peace within his own home. After the death of Emily, the woman he loved more than life itself, who had died giving birth to their quadruplet sons, Edward's world had split in half. Half of him remained forever in that delivery room. His sons, Oliver, Ethan, Liam, and Noah, 5 years old, were 4 reflections of the same storm. They didn't cry. They didn't talk about their mother. They simply destroyed, screamed, and defied. In 5 months, 18 nannies had fled, some in tears, others shouting, a few not even stopping to grab their bags. The mansion that once echoed with Emily's piano now resonated with shattering glass and children's rage. That morning, the storm outside was only an echo of the one inside. The living room was a battlefield of broken wood and splattered paint. A grandfather clock had stopped ticking the night before. Edward stood in the middle of it all, shirt wrinkled, coffee cold in hand. In the reflection of the window, he saw not a tech tycoon, but a widower slowly losing himself. He had tried everything: nannies, therapists, child specialists, all defeated. His sons had turned the house into a war zone: Oliver the commander, Ethan the trapmaker, Liam the destroyer, and Noah, who whispered to Mummy Emily in the mirror. The butler entered, sighing heavily. "Sir, the 18th nanny has just resigned." Edward didn't react. He only nodded, his eyes hollow. Deep down, he knew no one could cross the wall of grief that surrounded his children. No one until that day. A knock echoed through the rain. 3 times, steady, deliberate. The butler frowned, went to the door, and there, beneath the dim porch light, stood a woman with silver hair, a worn wool coat, and a scuffed leather suitcase. A cold gust of wind blew in, tossing a few strands of her hair across her face. Yet her eyes, calm, deep, unshaken, didn't flinch. Her name was Grace Morgan, and she had just stepped into the house where the storm never stopped. The door opened, and a gust of cold wind swept in, carrying the scent of damp earth and rain. The woman standing there, Grace Morgan, looked nothing like any nanny who had ever set foot in this house. No neat uniform, no polished smile. Only a faded gray wool coat, worn shoes, and a leather suitcase tied together with string. The butler, Mr. Henderson, frowned suspiciously. "Madam, this household doesn't hire people outside the agency. Perhaps you've come to the wrong address?" Grace smiled softly, a smile that seemed to bring a strange light into the dim hall. "No mistake, Mr. Henderson. I'm here to see Mr. Langford." Her voice wasn't loud or soft. It was simply steady. In a house where everyone shouted, her tone felt like a breath of calm drifting through the cracks of a storm. Edward came down the staircase, buttoning his coat, ready to leave for another meeting. When his eyes met Grace's, he froze. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. She stood there, still and calm, as if nothing in this house could scare her. Behind her, the 4 boys appeared, as if summoned by the wind. Oliver, the leader, crossed his arms, eyes sharp with suspicion. Ethan hid a toy hammer behind his back. Liam grinned mischievously. Noah, the quiet one, hovered at the back, half shadow. Grace bent down, kneeling so her eyes met theirs. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ask questions. She simply said, slowly and gently, I know what it feels like to lose the person who made your world make sense." The boys froze. For a heartbeat, even the rain outside seemed to stop. Noah was the first to speak, voice trembling. "You lost someone too?" Grace nodded, her eyes shimmering with a kind sadness. "Yes, but I learned that sometimes the ones who left us wouldn't want our home to become a place where laughter dies." Silence. Oliver's arms fell to his sides. Ethan dropped the toy hammer. Liam looked down. Noah stared at her, as if he'd just met someone who understood the language of his silence. From the staircase, Edward felt something stir in his chest. For 6 months, the house had known only tears and shouting. But now, for the first time, there was silence, not of fear, but of listening. Grace stood up, brushed her knees, and said, "I'm not here to command or control. I'm here to understand. If you'll allow me, I'd like to stay for a few days. No pay, no contract, just to see if I can help this house breathe again." Edward looked at her for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw no pity, no ambition, only understanding. He nodded quietly. "You have 3 days." Grace smiled and bowed slightly. Behind her, the 4 boys watched silently. The rain still fell, but inside the house where the storm had never stopped, a small warmth had begun to rise. Grace's first day in the Langford house passed amid wary glances and whispers behind her back. She didn't force anyone, didn't give orders, didn't set rules. She simply observed, quietly, patiently, as if listening to the heartbeat of a wounded home. She realized that each child had its own way of crying, even without tears. Oliver, the eldest, was the commander. He drew attack plans and gave orders to his siblings like a tiny general. But when Grace came near, he hid the maps under the table and pretended to be indifferent. She saw in his eyes the fear of losing control, a child trying to hold his family together by controlling it, afraid that if he let go, everything would fall apart again. Ethan, the second boy, spent hours assembling complex toys. With Lego pieces and bits of wire, he built traps and unstable systems just to see them work. Grace never destroyed his creations. She just watched his small hands tremble when connecting the final wire. She knew this wasn't a game. It was his way of reclaiming control in a world that had taken his mother from him. Liam, the third, was the real storm. His hands broke anything within reach. When Grace gently asked, "Why did you break this vase?" he answered bluntly, "Because it was going to break anyway. Everything breaks, sooner or later." Grace didn't scold him. She simply picked up the shards and said softly, "And when something breaks, sometimes we can still put it back together, can't we?" For the first time, Liam didn't respond with a scream. He just looked at her, silent. Noah, the youngest, was different. He spoke little and often sat alone before a mirror, whispering. The others called it talking to ghosts. Grace didn't interfere. She sat beside him, gazing into the old mirror. "Who are you talking to, Noah?" "Mom. She doesn't like this house being so dark." Grace nodded gently. "Then we'll light it up so she can see that you're still smiling, okay?" Noah didn't reply, but his tiny hand quietly reached for hers. That night, when the children were asleep, Grace sat in the dim living room and wrote everything down in an old leather notebook. "Each child carries a wound," she wrote. "They don't need discipline. They need to be seen. Every act of misbehavior is a cry adults have failed to hear." Upstairs, Edward sat in his office, the glow of the screen reflecting his tired face. He replayed the security footage. Grace walking through the hallway, gently picking up broken pieces, straightening a tilted family photo. No words, no judgment, just touching the pain with silent respect. He turned off the screen, leaned back, and exhaled. For the first time, a thought flickered in his mind. Maybe what the children need isn't a nanny, but someone brave enough to see their sorrow. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside the Langford house, the first drops of healing had already begun to fall. On the second day, the children decided to test whether Grace Morgan was truly as fearless as her calm demeanor suggested. Oliver led the charge, sketching out a plan in his little strategy notebook, his voice serious as a young officer. Operation: unexpected rain. Objective: make her run away before lunch. The other three nodded eagerly. Ethan prepared a bucket of water, Liam scattered marbles across the hallway, and Noah, though reluctant, hung a plastic spider over the living room doorway. The morning passed in an oddly tense silence. When Grace walked by, the children held their breath, eyes glinting with mischief. And then, splash! The bucket of water came crashing down over her head. The icy shock drenched her hair, but instead of screaming, Grace burst out laughing. Her laughter rang through the house, clear, warm, and unexpected, freezing the children in place. "Oh my, it's really raining indoors," she said, half amused, half playful. She stepped forward, her foot landing squarely on the marbles. Instead of falling, she twirled gracefully like a dancer and gave a little bow to her stunned audience at the end of the hallway. Oliver's eyes widened. Ethan forgot to laugh. Liam gasped, "Whoa," in pure awe. And Noah, for the first time since his mother's death, his eyes sparkled with light. When Grace entered the living room, she saw the plastic spider dangling from the doorframe. She gently took it down, placed it in her palm, and said softly, almost in a whisper, "You know, even the creatures we fear the most, sometimes they're just looking for a safe place." Then she set the little spider on the bookshelf, right beside an old photo of Emily. It was a small gesture, but it reached the deepest corner of the children's hearts. That afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. No shouting, no running, no crashing sounds. Grace changed out of her wet clothes, brewed a pot of tea, and sat by the fireplace reading, as if the morning's chaos had never happened. That night, as the four children peeked down the stairs, Oliver whispered, "Why isn't she angry?" Noah replied softly, "Maybe, because she understands." Later, when they tiptoed into Grace's room, they carried the empty bucket, returning the spoils of war. Grace smiled, took it from them without a word. "Good night, my four little conspirators." "Good night, Mrs." Noah hesitated, then finished quietly. "Grace?" For the first time, the Langford house went dark in effortless peace. No one realized it yet, but that morning had become the very moment the house learned how to laugh again. The next morning, the smell of freshly baked bread drifted through the Langford house, something that hadn't happened since Emily's passing. Every morning since then, breakfast had been served by the private chef in heavy silence. But that day, the children woke up to a strange, comforting aroma and the soft sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. Grace stood there, wearing a small floral apron, her hands rolling dough on the wooden counter. It wasn't the fine white flour delivered from the fancy bakery. It was the ordinary kind, uneven in texture, with a bit of it dusted across her cheek. When Oliver, the first to peek in, asked, "What are you doing?" Grace didn't look up. She simply smiled. Bread. The other three boys appeared right after, curious. She didn't ask them to help, just continued her work, as if knowing that curiosity was the first step toward connection. 5 minutes later, Ethan couldn't resist any longer. He pulled up a chair beside her. "Can I roll the dough?" "Of course," she said, "but each of you must make your own kind." She divided the dough into 4 parts, placed one before each child, and spoke in a tone both gentle and serious, as if giving them an important mission. "Oliver, you'll make the crusty bread. A leader must know when to use strength and when to wait. Ethan, you'll make the sweet bread. Everything you touch is precise, but sometimes a bit of spontaneity creates the real flavor. Liam, you'll make the dense loaf. Punch the dough hard if you must, but remember, not everything strong needs to be broken. Noah, you'll make the fruit-filled roll. Hide the sweetness inside where others can't see it. The 4 boys got to work. At first clumsy, then gradually absorbed. The kitchen, once a forbidden zone, filled with voices, laughter, the scent of melting butter, and the sound of hands working dough. When the first batch came out of the oven, Grace didn't grade them. She simply looked at each loaf with quiet reverence. "None of these are more perfect than the others," she said softly, "because perfection isn't about how alike they are, it's about the story each one carries." For the first time, lunchtime in that house wasn't a battlefield. The 4 boys laughed, argued about whose bread tasted best, then burst into giggles when they caught Noah sneaking extra honey into his. Edward came home halfway through the day, planning only to grab some files. But as he stepped into the kitchen, he froze. His 4 sons were sitting around a table with a woman he barely knew, and they were laughing. The sight, so simple, tightened his chest in a way he couldn't explain. Grace looked up, smiled, and handed him a small piece of bread. "Try it," she said. "Don't ask what kind it is. Guess who made it?" Edward took a bite, sweet and salty, crisp outside, soft inside. "This one? Oliver's?" "No," Grace laughed. "Liam's, the strongest boy, with the hands that tremble the most when kneading dough." Edward looked at her, and for reasons he couldn't name, warmth began to spread through him. For 6 months he had lived in silence, and now the smallest sound, a child's laugh, made him want to stay just a little longer. He spoke first. "Mrs. Morgan." Grace looked up. The light of the setting sun streamed through her silver hair, softening her face in a way that made her look almost radiant. "Yes, Mr. Langford?" He was silent for a few seconds, as if searching for the right words. "How long have you been here now?" "Exactly 3 days, sir." He took a few steps closer, his hands in his pockets, eyes still fixed on the children playing nearby. "I don't know what you've done to them," he said quietly. But for the past 6 months, I hadn't heard that kind of laughter. Grace only smiled gently. "I didn't do anything. I just let them be themselves." Edward turned to her then, his voice lower, more sincere than ever. "You said you didn't want a contract or a salary." He hesitated, the words heavy on his tongue. "But what if I said, I don't want another employee. I want someone who stays, not because she must, but because this house finally feels alive with her in it." Grace froze slightly, her hands pausing mid-stitch. "Stay?" "Yes," he said, voice lower. "Officially, as the one who keeps this family breathing." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glistening but bright. "All right, Mr. Langford, I'll stay, but only on one condition." "What is it?" "Don't call me Mrs. Morgan, call me Grace. Here, I'm not staff, I'm part of this home." He nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. Then, "Welcome home, Grace." In that instant, the evening breeze drifted through the open window, carrying with it the scent of dough, of tea, and the quiet warmth of a new beginning. From the day Grace officially stayed, the Langford house seemed to breathe to a different rhythm. No more heavy mornings, no more doors slammed shut in silence. The children learned to set the table, to pour milk for each other, and sometimes to sit quietly reading beside Grace without being told to. Even Edward, who used to come home only to sleep, began lingering a little longer in the living room before leaving for work. But peace always arrives hand in hand with a test. One morning, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the gallery room. When Grace rushed in, she saw it. The antique porcelain vase Edward once called irreplaceable, now scattered into hundreds of pieces. The 4 boys stood side by side, silent. Oliver's fists were clenched, Liam's head hung low. Grace looked at the scene, then at the children. She didn't shout, didn't scold, Her voice was as soft as a breath. "Is anyone hurt?" No one answered. Only guilty eyes flickered toward the floor. This vase was precious because it was old and rare, but what made it truly valuable was the time and the heart of the one who created it. The children stayed quiet. Then Oliver whispered, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Grace. We just wanted to see how strong it really was." Grace nodded gently, without blame. "Tomorrow we'll go see something together, not as punishment, but to learn what true beauty means." The next day, Glasgow was cold and heavy with fog. Grace took the boys to a small pottery workshop by the River Clyde. An old craftsman greeted them with a bow, his hands covered in clay, his smile kind and patient. "Are you going to teach us how to make pottery?" Ethan asked. "No," Grace smiled. "Today we'll only watch, just look. Do nothing else." For 8 long hours the children sat around the spinning wheel. The craftsman shaped a lump of lifeless clay, turning, trimming, fixing, only to start over again each time it tilted or collapsed. Liam grew restless. "Why don't you just throw it away and make a new one?" The old man chuckled. "Because if I give up, I'll never know if it could have become something beautiful." Noah, sitting in Grace's lap, whispered, "Grandma, a vase is like a person, isn't it?" Grace nodded softly. "Yes, fragile, but when loved, it can stand strong." When the vase was finally complete, the 4 boys clapped. The craftsman placed it carefully into the kiln and said, "This is the hardest part. The fire will test whether it's strong enough to survive." Grace turned to the boys. "And sometimes pain is that fire. It doesn't come to destroy us, but to shape us into something more beautiful." That evening, they returned home. The house glowed warmly with light. The children said nothing. They simply began gathering the broken shards of the old vase. Ethan arranged them carefully. Oliver brought glue. Liam held Noah's hand to keep him from getting hurt. The 4 of them sat together, patiently piecing the fragments one by one. When Edward walked in, he froze. Before him stood the once broken vase, clumsily mended yet full of love, its cracks glowing softly under the golden light. "My boys," Edward's voice caught. "Why?" Oliver replied. "Because something broken can still be beautiful, if we try." Edward looked at the vase, then at Grace. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just a lesson for the children, but for himself. Emily's death had shattered him, but perhaps he too could learn how to piece himself back together. That night, when the children were asleep, Edward passed by the living room and saw the warm glow of a lamp spilling through the doorway. Grace was sitting there, a cup of cold tea on the table, her eyes distant, as if she were speaking to someone only she could see. He stepped inside, his voice gentle. "You're still awake?" Grace startled slightly, then smiled. "I don't sleep much. There are nights when memories refuse to let you rest." Edward sat down across from her. After a few moments of silence, he said quietly, "Grace, I've always felt that you understand my pain better than anyone. Why is that?" She looked at him, her gaze soft, conflicted, as though deciding whether to keep something hidden or finally release it. At last, she spoke in a trembling whisper, "Because I've lived with that same pain." He said nothing, just waited. For a long moment, only the sound of the fire filled the room, soft, alive, almost like a heartbeat. And then Grace's secret began to unfold, slowly, painfully, like fog dissolving under the first light of dawn. 28 years ago, she began, I gave birth to 4 boys, quadruplets just like your sons. Quadruplets, Edward repeated, barely believing his ears. Yes, 4 little ones, Daniel, Michael, Peter, and John. They were my whole world. A faint smile crossed her lips, though it quivered at the edges. Their father left before they were even born. I raised all four alone. Life was hard, but I never felt tired. Her voice grew thin, fragile as thread. 6 years ago, on my 50th birthday, they threw me a surprise party. Afterward, they insisted on driving home together, in one car like when they were kids. And then? Edward's voice cracked. A truck lost control. None of them survived. The room fell silent. The lamp flickered softly in the draft. I buried 4 white coffins, she whispered, in one day. Edward couldn't speak. Tears slid down his face. He wasn't even sure for whom they fell, for her, for himself, or for the souls that were gone. Grace continued, her voice trembling but steady. I tried to die 3 times, but I failed each time. I thought maybe God was mocking me. Until one night I saw you on television, talking about the fear of losing your child, the helplessness of a father who no longer knew how to reach his children's hearts. That night, she said with a faint, tearful smile, I understood why I was still alive. I knew I had to come here. Edward buried his face in his hands. Grace, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, she replied softly. I didn't come here to save anyone. I came to live again. Because when we save someone, sometimes we are the ones who are saved. She paused, looking at him deeply before adding, I saw in your children the same anger I once saw in my own, the anger of children who lost their mother. I knew. Only love could calm that rage. Edward nodded, his eyes wet. You didn't just save the children, Grace. You saved me, too. Grace smiled faintly, her laughter light and sorrowful, like an old melody. No, Edward, it's the children who saved us both. In that moment, 2 souls who had lost everything sat facing each other in the dim golden light, not as employer and servant, but as kindred spirits who had finally learned that pain, too, can be a language of love. Outside, the snow fell thicker and heavier, but inside that quiet room, the small flame of understanding burned bright. The next morning, soft sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the Langford kitchen in a gentle golden hue. Grace was preparing breakfast as usual when the 4 children came running in, laughing noisily. No one knew that Edward had spent the entire night awake, thinking about her story. When he came down the stairs, his eyes were different, no longer those of the master of the house, but of a man who understood. While the children gathered around the table, Edward spoke softly. Grace, I think it's time the boys knew a little about your past. Grace looked at him, hesitant, but when she saw the trust in his eyes, she nodded. She set down the spoon, wiped her hands on her apron, and sat beside the 4 boys. Her voice was low and tender, as if she feared breaking the calm of the morning. My dears, I once had 4 sons, just like you, mischievous, loud, and full of life. But now they're in heaven. I believe they're watching over children who still need to be loved. The kitchen fell utterly silent. Noah was the first to speak, his voice trembling. Are you sad? Of course, Grace smiled, her eyes glistening. But when we're sad and still choose to love, that sadness becomes strength. Oliver stared at her for a long moment. Ethan and Liam lowered their heads. Then Noah whispered, So, if your sons are in heaven and we're down here, can you be our mom here? The air froze for a heartbeat. Grace looked at the youngest boy. Those innocent eyes made her heart tremble. A mother? She said softly. I could never replace your mother, Emily. Not replace, Noah interrupted gently. Mom's in heaven and you're here. We need both. Ethan reached out and took her hand. Can we call you Aunt Grace? He asked quietly. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then Grace smiled, a smile as warm as sunlight. If that's what you wish, I would be honored." The four boys wrapped their arms around her. Noah buried his face in her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for staying with us." 1 year later, spring returned, gentle, forgiving. The Langford garden, once a silent witness to grief, now bloomed with laughter and light. Today was the memorial for Emily, the woman who remained the soul of the house even after she had left this world. The four boys, now taller and more mature, wore white shirts and held small photo albums Grace had made for them. They stood before a simple headstone engraved with the words, "Emily Langford, where love began." All six of them, Edward, Grace, and the four children, knelt together. There were no tears, only the scent of flowers carried by a gentle breeze. Oliver spoke first, his voice steady and clear. "Mom, we know you can see us." Ethan continued, his eyes shining. "Thank you, Mom, for sending Aunt Grace to us." Liam added softly, "We haven't forgotten you, but we think you'd be happy knowing we're loved again." Noah placed his small hand on the headstone and whispered, "Mom, may I ask your permission to let Aunt Grace be our earthly mom?" The entire garden fell silent, and then, from the gray sky above, a single golden ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, shining upon all six of them. No one spoke, but everyone understood. It was her answer. Edward turned to Grace. His eyes glistened, but his smile was gentle. He knelt in the garden and took her hand. "I don't want to replace what was lost," he said in a low, steady voice. "I just want to rebuild something new, from the ashes." Grace lowered her head. Tears fell, but her lips curved into a smile. The four children wrapped their arms around them, a warm circle where old pain melted away, making room for something miraculous and new. A month later, a small wedding was held in the blooming garden. There was no luxury, no grand gown, only family, friends, and the many families who had been helped through the Emily Langford Foundation. The boys ran around, pinning flowers into Grace's hair, while Edward smiled, watching the woman who had brought light back into his life. A year after that, amid laughter and the scent of blossoms, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Emily Grace Langford, uniting two generations, two souls, two stories. The garden was now known as the Garden of Joyful Memories. Roses planted by Oliver, lavender by Ethan, daisies tended by Liam, and the small patch of wildflowers Noah had sown, all bloomed together. On the same soil, Emily's flowers and Grace's flowers blossomed side by side, radiant under the sunlight, a symbol of the past and present living as one. Edward and Grace sat together on a wooden bench, hand in hand, watching the children play with the little girl. Sunlight touched their faces, not a blinding light, but the gentle glow of a love that had walked through darkness to find itself again. Grace whispered, her voice as soft as the wind, "From the darkest ashes, the brightest light is born." Edward smiled and replied, "Love doesn't die when we lose someone. It is reborn every time we dare to love again beyond the chaos." The sky stretched endlessly blue, the garden filled with laughter. And in that sound, perhaps, Emily was smiling too.